Okay. Native American oral traditions. Storytelling. In our society today, our images of Native Americans come from several different places. They come from old westerns, cowboy and Indian movies. They come from stories about the first Thanksgiving that we might get in history class, or we might get it from something we've read, Longfellow's epic poem, The Song of Hiawatha. Unfortunately, this gives us a somewhat singular view of a very diverse group of people. We get a very one-sided image to something that's actually a lot more complex. And going right along with this, Native American stories have long been told by somebody else, and it wasn't until the late 1800s where we realized Native Americans even had literature, Western scholars. And when I say Western scholars, in this PowerPoint presentation, the Western world refers to most of Europe and the Americas. Most of Europe and the Americas. So Western scholars thought that Native Americans had no literature, and they ignored all the oral literature that had been passed down for generation to generation to generation over the centuries. These included epic narratives, stories, oratories or speeches, songs, poems, and chants. If ever I'm going too fast and you are finding yourself having a hard time keeping up, please feel free to pause the video so that you can fill in those guided notes. Many people don't realize that Western literature also has its roots in the oral tradition. A lot of things that we read and study in school were told long before they were written down. Ancient Western classics like the Odyssey and Beowulf, they were only told orally for centuries before someone finally wrote them down. So telling their own stories, what prevented them from doing this? One problem with us knowing and having access to this rich body of literature was that scholars had to translate Native American texts from hundreds of different languages. There was hundreds of different languages spoken between all the different tribes of Native Americans in North America. And in recent decades, American Indian writers have revitalized their literature by combining their fluency in English and a deep understanding of their own languages and traditions. Here are some prominent American Indian writers that if you haven't read previously, you likely will read at least one of them one day. N. Scott Momaday, Louise Erdrich, Simon Ortiz. Sherman Alexie is someone that I myself have read a lot of. Highly recommended. Okay, so many cultures and a shared tradition. Despite different languages and cultures, despite the rich diversity in Native American oral tradition, we can make some generalizations about the ones we'll be reading in this class. First, Native American oral tradition teaches moral lessons and conveys practical information about the natural world. That's the first point. Two, it reflects a more inclusive view of the natural world, a world not dominated by human beings. And three, shows an awareness, the power of words to make things happen. Words are very powerful. Okay, so that first point, teaches moral lessons and conveys practical information about the natural world. Consider this brief retelling of a story from the Abenaki people of Maine. After Gluskabe caught all the game animals in the woods, his grandmother made him return them all, much to his dismay. "They'll die in your bag," she told him. "That's not where they live, and then there won't be any game left for anyone else." Considering this brief excerpt, let's think about the moral lessons and practical information about the natural world that are embedded there. What's the moral lesson? We need to avoid greed. We need to share with others. Also, the wisdom and knowledge of our elders, how we need to respect and listen to our elders, and the practical information about the natural world, game management, and preservation of our natural resources, our food supplies. So even in that brief excerpt there's valuable lessons and practical information. Okay, our second point reflects a more inclusive view of the natural world, a world not dominated by human beings. In Native American oral traditions, the stories we're going to be reading, animals and humans... Excuse me, just one moment. Okay, apologies for that. Okay, so animals and humans are often interchangeable in these myths and folk tales in Native American oral tradition. Origin myths may feature animals as the instruments of creation, so they might have these godlike, mythic qualities about them. In Western literature, again, most of Europe and the Americas, the universe and the natural world are more typically dominated by humans. That's just the way of it. Not the case with Native American oral traditions. In these types of stories, animals more often play the important roles. Lastly, that third generalization we can make shows an awareness of the power of words to make things happen. Words are powerful and alive. Words can bring the rain, cure the sick, and even destroy an enemy. There's power in words. In Native American culture, there's an endless circle of history with oral tradition. Passed on from generation to generation, oral traditions preserve history. That being said, the oral tradition is also dynamic and responsive to change. So while in pre-Columbian times the Lakota went to the annual Sundance on foot, after the Spanish came, they went on horseback. In modern times, they arrived by automobile. So in American Indian worldview, history is an endless cycle, just like the cycles of the natural world. Whereas in Western tradition, history is more linear. It's more of a straight line versus how it is viewed in Native American culture. The progress from foot to horse isn't what's important because it's just another way to get to the same place. Okay, and you do not have to write this last piece down, but I want you to think as we're ending this presentation, what 3 generalizations can you make about American Indian oral traditions, Native American oral traditions? I want you to recap those 3 generalizations we can make about the readings we'll be doing in this unit. And then I want you to name one difference between Native American tradition and Western tradition that was discussed in this presentation. I want you to think about that on your own.